During the 60s, there was no such thing as 911.
There wasn't really a such thing as an ambulance.
I can't imagine how many lives were lost just because pre-hospital care was not a thing.
We needed to have something to change.
A mini emergency room in the back of a vehicle. That's like crazy.
It didn't start in Jacksonville or Miami. It started right here in Pittsburgh by a group of black men that, by society's standards, would not amount to anything.
Freedom House Ambulance changed the game.
Being a paramedic, you're trained in advanced life support. You actually do things as a paramedic that a nurse doesn't do. I didn't expect some of the ways that they would affect me personally. But I did get some pretty good calls. As a paramedic, we had this young man who was shot. And we get him in the back of our ambulance, and he's saying, I can't breathe, and I couldn't hear lung sounds over his right side, which meant that his right lung had collapsed. Sticking a needle that big in someone's chest, it wasn't for the faint of heart, let's just say that. We did successfully get him to the hospital alive. The same scenario, and it happened in the 60s. The outcome would have been much worse. That person absolutely would have died. He would have died before we even left the scene.
Pittsburgh in 1963. I would call it a somewhat tight-knit community, but we really had grown accustomed to living with less, for lack of a better term. During that time frame, your bars were very prominent. You had jazz clubs that were prominent. Public housing was more or less the segregated way of putting blacks there.
The Hill District, it was like a Harlem.
The community itself was a condensed community, but it was also somewhat underserved and neglected. It had a very, what I would call, adversarial relationship during that time with the police. The police were looked at as more or less of a threat than as someone that you would call for help.
At that period of time, it was the police officers that were providing EMS care, at least I would say quote unquote, because at that time it wasn't defined as that.
There was no such thing as 911. You would call a 7-digit number and you would talk to perhaps a police dispatcher, and they would get your name and your address, and if it was a medical emergency, they would dispatch a police wagon. And the police wagon itself was comprised predominantly of white males with very minimal medical training. So if you could imagine a police wagon pulling up in front of your residence and two white males getting out and placing you into back on a canvas cot and took you to the emergency room. If something happened while you were back there, you stopped breathing or your heart stopped beating, there was no one back there to provide any type of medical assistance. You were at their mercy. That's
Even if it was deemed that they were, in whoever's eyes, sick enough to go to the hospital. An ambulance was unheard of.
All over for that time, that morbidity and mortality was high. It was especially high in neighborhoods that were underserved, and typically neighborhoods that had predominantly Black people, Latin A people, Native American.
I can't imagine how many people all over the world, their lives were lost just because pre-hospital care was not a thing.
The Department of Transportation analyzed how many people were dying from just motor vehicle accidents, and they found that it was astronomical. A lot of people had preventable deaths. So that's where we then come into Freedom House Ambulance Incorporated. Really, the origination of the idea was in 1965. Dr. Peter Safar, a trailblazer of his time. He was the chair of anesthesiology at Presbyterian Hospital.
Peter Safar invented CPR.
He was able to take those new things that he was coming up with and correlate when it came to EMS. The mayor was very receptive to something new and also a change maker.
Civil rights leader and USW representative James McCoy is president of the board of Freedom House Enterprise Incorporated, and the project director is a professional ambulance service operator, Gerald Esposito. This emergency service is under contract to the city of Pittsburgh and is supported by a number of organizations.
When you're doing things that are so dynamic and so against the grain, you need a tidal wave, you need a tornado, you need a natural disaster to get everyone to get on board. That's where they came together to coalesce with forming Freedom House Ambulance.
The needs of the community were not being met. Freedom House was necessary. It was a bold endeavor, but it was one that changed the history of pre-hospital care.
I didn't look good on paper, but I said, wow, why can't I do that? Here I am, my hospital orderly. I've been doing this for 5 years. I was in a room one day and 2 Freedom House paramedics came in. And they just commanded the attention of that room. Their uniforms were crisp and neatly pressed, and they had a radio that was murmuring something and I couldn't make out, but I just was in awe of these 2 guys. They had afros and beards. I happened to look at a patch on their uniform and it said Freedom House Ambulance Service. And I said, wow, why can't I do that?
That period of time in the Hill District, Black people were being treated as secondhand citizens. So they were not given as much rights. They were not given jobs. They were really out on the street.
Serviced by 19 highly trained technicians in acute medicine, graduated from a comprehensive 32-week training program. They are experienced in administering emergency care at the scene and on the way to the hospital.
The training itself was the most rigorous that had ever been done in this country outside of the hospital. There was time spent in intensive care units, the emergency room, the operating room, the obstetrics units, assisting in the delivery of infants. No one had ever done that before.
It was a unique program in the fact that they were called unemployable. And that could be for a wide variety of reasons. It could be education-based. It could be some of them may have had criminal histories or just being disadvantaged and not having opportunities. I cannot imagine the difficulties that they had to face, because here you have a group of young African Americans and you're going to teach them what? How to save somebody's life?
We all had a part of our lives that didn't look good on paper, for lack of a better term. And the beauty of that is that we never allowed our past to determine our future. Wonderful people, despite the way society looked at us.
They were saving so many Black lives at an astronomical level compared to anywhere in the nation.
It was a moment that said to me, I finally arrived. I've achieved what turned out to be, and I didn't know it at the time, was my calling. And from that point on, I look forward to going to work every day. I was eager, waiting on that particular life-threatening call to come, because here I am racing to the scene, and I'm going to make a difference in this person's life.
Freedom House's ambulance service was one of a kind. It was the first in the country. It was different because someone had the bright idea to put a mini emergency room in the back of a vehicle. That's like crazy. And to save someone's life in the back of that vehicle and have all of the immediate equipment and medications needed to stabilize someone. Some of the things that made Freedom House, we still use today. The principles we still use today. The life-saving techniques like CPR we use today. They were putting in IVs. They were breathing for people. All of the things that we do now, it was just unheard of. I think that every facet of emergency medical services can be linked back to Freedom House.
Now, especially with their opioid epidemic, people are thinking, oh, Narcan, this is something that just came out. Not at all. Narcan was back with Freedom House. They were the first to really administer Narcan. Freedom House Ambulance changed the game, where now you're providing care en route and transport. Dr. Nancy Caroline took over, and so she became the EMS director for Freedom House Ambulance Incorporated. And she was the first one that made the first paramedic book. She was the originator of the writing up of what a paramedic should be.
Oftentimes, we arrive at the scene and there's total chaos, and we are trained to bring order and calmness to that confusion and chaotic type situation. We arrive at this person's home who's having trouble breathing. He's still breathing, but he's laboring. And my partner and I called our medical director, Dr. Nancy Caroline, and gave her the specifics of the details. And she said, intubate the patient and start an IV on him. I thought she had lost her mind. And I asked her to repeat that. She said, intubate this patient and start an IV on him. So I asked my partner to set up the equipment. I went ahead and intubated the patient, and we transported him to the emergency room. It's a procedure that was exclusively reserved for doctors, anesthesiologists, or anesthetists, and designed exclusively for the operating room and or the emergency room. It had never been done outside of the hospital before.
Chief Moon was the first lay person, meaning a person who had no medical experience, to actually intubate a person. In California and some other states where they were doing like EKGs, but they weren't doing all the things with life-saving equipment and skills like they were doing in Pittsburgh. They didn't have the full encompassing comprehensiveness as Freedom House. We're talking about the outcomes being better in underserved neighborhoods, and now Black people are having better survivability rates than white people. So now you're having suburban white people being like, wait a minute, we want to have good outcomes, we want to live. So then it became talks of expanding Freedom House to cover the entire city. When Mayor Pete Flaherty came into the mix, he did not like Freedom House. And it's definitely evident in some of the policies that he made, and especially taking away assets and funding for Freedom House.
Society as a whole was not accustomed to a group of Black guys dressed in white uniforms with afros and beards coming to provide a service to you. So we were confronted with people with their own personal prejudices. An entirely new set of hurdles awaited. It was somewhat traumatic. We were placed into an environment where we weren't wanted.
They were a victim of their own success.
You would think if Freedom House Ambulance is being successful, why not just keep it with Freedom House Ambulance and call it a day? But no.
One of the drawbacks at Freedom House is we were a predominantly Black organization. The mayor of the city of Pittsburgh at that time didn't have control over this organization, and he was running for re-election. So some of his constituents in some of your affluent neighborhoods complained to him that how dare you allow those individuals in those rundown, underserved neighborhoods have better medical care than I do. The mayor had to bow to the wishes of his constituents, but he just couldn't just wipe us away, so he had to come up with strategic, I will call them obstacles. Imagine you're calling for an ambulance and it can't use its siren to come to your home to get you, stopping at every red light and waiting for the light to change.
During the past 3 years in Philadelphia, $1.5 million has been received for emergency care, but in Allegheny County, only a mere $30,000.
Mayor Pete Flaherty decided to make his own EMS agency. He wanted to have an all-white EMS system. Now, he definitely was one of the most single-handed of the demise of Freedom House.
I was working the 40-12 shift on that day, and we finally got the last call and signed off the air and turned everything over to the city of Pittsburgh.
Now you have a mayor, and he is now implementing policies that are completely unjustifiable. For instance, he put a policy that anyone who had a criminal record could not be a provider. Freedom House Ambulance was built upon people who had criminal records. You have now written tests. They're the ones who literally gave the data for these tests. And now you're giving them a test of what they know and recognizing that a lot of them did come from backgrounds that had high school diplomas, maybe a GED, maybe 8th grade, 7th grade education.
We were placed in a position that I would call survival of the fittest. If you could imagine a Black organization being taken over by a complete white organization. Unfortunately, the department went on a systematic way of eliminating as many of Freedom House's employees as it possibly could, and was very, very successful. I was relegated to the role of an observer. And I couldn't talk on the radio, I couldn't examine patients, couldn't drive the vehicles, I was just sitting there.
How is it that the first person who ever intubated, ever, as a lay person, can no longer touch a patient?
As fate would have it, I went on a call with the crew that I was working with, and we walked into a person's home, and the person was unconscious, not breathing, and didn't have a heartbeat. And the crew that I was working with didn't know what to do. So they looked at the person that wasn't allowed to do anything. So I started assigning duties, and you put the EKG on, you set up the IV, I'll do the tracheal intubation, and we subsequently saved the person's life. And that was great, but it had to be kept quiet because I wasn't allowed to do anything. So from that point on, I had to make a decision that said, do I remain this passive, unnoticed individual, or do I step up my game and become more assertive, more outspoken? And I chose the latter. I wanted the department as a whole to know exactly who John Moon was. I started getting promoted up to the ranks. I became the outspoken advocate for diversity within the department.
I get to hug the chief of Pittsburgh EMS.
Yeah, I remember her, and she often tells the story. She walked in off the street and stormed into my office and says, I'm here looking for a job.
I don't quite remember it like that, but okay. No, seriously, that's what happened.
That's exactly what happened.
I said, hey, my name is Amira, and I'm interested in a career in EMS. I came in and I sat and we just talked, and the rest is history.
The department was struggling with diversity at that particular time, and I was tasked with the responsibility to right that wrong. I had made myself a promise that if I got into a position to change that, I would devote the rest of my career here at doing that. The department at that time, its main focus was to eliminate any memory of Freedom House. And in order to do that, you have to get rid of the people. So if you get rid of the history makers, you essentially get rid of the history that they made.
And it's very sad that that story was intentionally trying to be erased. Or, I would say, kept under lock and key. This is such a phenomenal, spectacular story.
I want the world to know that this organization is the foundation of EMS across this country. It started right here in Pittsburgh in the Hill District by a group of Black men that by society's standards would not amount to anything.
It's taken 50 years. That's how long ago it's been since Freedom House was in existence. I didn't know about Freedom House at all when I started with Pittsburgh EMS. I proudly sit here because of Freedom House, and I'm the first Black female chief of EMS. They paved the way for me to sit here, so I can do nothing but try my best to make them proud.
As I think back of the hurdles and barriers and setbacks and broken promises and disappointments that we all endured at Freedom House, and then I look at her and I can smile and say it was all worth it.